My guest today is Professor Glenn Cohen, who's Professor of Law and Faculty Director for the Center for Health Law Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics at Harvard University. His current research relates to medical AI, mobile health, abortion, reproduction technology, the therapeutic use of psychedelic drugs, research ethics, organ transplantation, rationing in law and medicine, health policy, FDA law, translational medicine, medical tourism, and many other topics. Um, that's a lot, Glenn. You've been a busy guy. Just
Maybe I have attention deficit disorder, the academic version of it, perhaps.
Yes, yes. But I'm interested in all these topics. I had some peripheral exposure to pharmaceuticals and medical practice. And my daughter's an OBGYN resident at Case Western, so we've been having some conversations around that. Um, so I want to start with sort of a very topical subject, exposed elections that just happened. Who will save legal access to emergency abortion? So you say here in the 2024 term, the Supreme Court agreed to decide the consolidated cases of Moyle versus United States and Idaho versus United States. The cases asked whether the Federal Emergency Medical Treatment and Active Labor Act, EMTALA, requires that hospitals provide abortions when needed to protect the health of the pregnant person, even if prohibited by state law. Despite the critical implications of the cases, the court effectively decided not to decide. 6 justices, I can probably guess who those 6 are, agreed not to issue a substantive ruling, instead restoring a district court injunction that prevents Idaho's abortion ban from being enforced when it conflicts with EMTALA. So yeah, this is really interesting. So I don't know much about the legal arena, Glenn. So when something like this comes up, there's a huge difference if the Supreme Court actually provides a decision as opposed to just kicking the can down the road, so to speak, and rely on something else for that. I mean, how does this work?
Yeah, so this particular case, it's a great instance of this. And, there are different ways of deciding cases, but this plus the old maxim that elections have consequences, I think will be really important because the Biden administration took the view that the statute you mentioned, the EMTALA statute, preempts, that's the legal term, that is basically trumps a piece of federal law, contrary state law, and claim that there's a conflict between the statute, which requires you to treat or transfer, and essentially what Idaho and now a couple other states have in place regarding health of the mother. And had the Supreme Court agreed with that, the Idaho statute would be essentially be held to violate EMTALA and thus be unlawful. Had they rejected that, the Idaho statute would go on its way. But what they did instead, by not deciding it, is essentially they've now set the deck. So either we'll have more litigation on it, or more likely now that we have the Trump presidency, my best guess is that the Trump Health and Human Services Department will withdraw the legal view and the legal opinion that causes the conflict and the interpretation of the EMTALA statute that causes the conflict. And as a result, the states like Idaho, states like Texas, states that have restrictions that many would say interfere with the health of mothers, and the briefing in the case suggests that we had women who had to be airlifted out of the state for abortions that the physicians believe were unlawful under the state's law. That will persist into the Trump administration. And we will see if there's a future Democratic administration, whether they try to turn it back or not. But the Supreme Court, I think, judiciously, for its sake, decided not to decide, as opposed to making a decision that might have angered many individuals who believe, whatever your views about abortion generally, these were pretty compelling stories of women who needed abortions.
I saw something come through. I haven't really seen the data. that seems to argue that in the states that are very abortion um, against abortion, let's say, uh, the body's piling up, and those statistics are not really released in a comprehensive fashion. And in 2024, I am, yeah, like half the country is puzzled at where we are, right? So medical doctors have an obligation to their patients. I mean, that's what they go to medical school for. And now it's unclear what their obligation is. Yeah.
Yeah, and an important piece of this is to realize the majority of abortions done in America are medical abortions, typically through mifepristone and misoprostol, the two drug cocktail. And so, this is a subset of abortions we're talking about that where the EMTALA statute comes involved. But part of it is that we're squeezing the toothpaste on all sides, and the hydraulic pressure, something has to go somewhere because there's also been attacks on mifepristone and its approval, and there's some questions about what the new Health and Human Services and what the new FDA, what their view will be. There's the emergency abortions. We have more states kind of open to the idea of personhood, embryonic or fetal personhood. And then we have the reality that currently with the checkerboard, but as the checkerboard of state policies tilts towards red, the further people will have to drive and travel out of state. And while some women may be in a position to travel out of state and get an out of state abortion, first off, that's not all women. Think about a woman whose partner doesn't know they're pregnant, partner might be opposed to the abortion, might be susceptible to domestic violence. Think about somebody who has other children and can't leave them for 3 or 4 days and try to
Mm.
drive somewhere, doesn't have the money for a plane ticket. So that's a piece of it. And then there's also questions about whether states will seek to restrict interstate travel for abortion. And we've seen some states interested in kind of going after portions of the travel for minor patients, so patients under the age of majority who need abortions, as claims about trafficking and the like. So I think we continue to see significant hydraulic pressure that's making abortion harder to get. Although interestingly, the statistics suggest, per my understanding, and again, I'm not a demographer, but divided by the number of people in the population, the number of abortions being performed in the US has actually gone up, not down, since
Mm.
the watershed Dobbs decision overruling Roe v. Wade. So part of it might be that many people who are not sure now want to act very early because they might be in a state where they don't know whether they're going to be able to access abortion later on, or maybe it's something else that's going on here demographically, sociologically.
Yeah, in some sense, it's a risk management issue for the person, right? So, I mean, so I want to sort of understand the status quo here. So, let's say in one of those states where abortion is considered the biggest sin that somebody could commit, and the mother is at risk of her own life, and this, I mean, it could happen much later. So the mother didn't have an option to travel out of state to get on a train or a bus or whatever, right? So now she's in a hospital, and the doctor determines her life is at risk. What are the options left to her at this point?
Yeah, I think it's important to just to be precise about the distinction between life of the mother versus health of the mother exceptions, and there's some move between them. But these cases are mostly about health of the mother, so serious complications. I think the cases that are in some ways the most shocking, and again, I'm trained in philosophy in part, and I understand disagreement, and I also understand a lot why, for many people who are want to restrict abortion, how important this is and why they really view the personhood of the fetus. So I'm very sympathetic to understanding their viewpoint. But the cases that I think are the most interesting here are instances where, first of all, there's risk to the life of the mother, or there's kind of risk. These are people who want to have families, right? But it turns out the pregnancy that they're carrying is one that's unlikely to be viable. And
Mhm.
by obstructing their access to abortion, we're also making it less likely they're going to be able to reproduce going forward, right? So losing future fertility. So to me, I would have hoped that there'd be some ability, whatever you think about the larger questions of abortion, to reach some alignment on
Mm,
these cases. They don't seem to be as hard as the general question about abortion's availability. And it's possible that this is, a question of politics and a question of political economy and the posturing of various individuals in terms of their future legislative, gubernatorial, maybe even presidential goals here and signaling where they are on these
mhm.
issues. But I would
Yeah.
love to see kind of an ability to actually realize that there's much where good people who disagree on some fundamental things about abortion could overlap and agree on. But if it's not the health of the mother cases or the life of the mother cases, I'm
Mm.
not sure what daylight there is in spaces where there are to come to reasonable agreements.
Yeah, so this puts things in a little bit of an interesting perspective for me, Glenn. So I'm going to argue against myself for a minute. So if I put them, sort of a matrix, the child on x-axis and the mother on y-axis, and let's say technology improve sufficiently that we can predict, I'm just making this up, I haven't really thought through this, we can predict the child's prognosis, not just to live, but rather to thrive. So, I mean, we have a lot of, CNS issues that we can identify now, pre-birth. Um, that could lead us to a position where we say we sort of selectively cull babies, right? So that is somewhat problematic, isn't it?
I mean, there's definitely problems with it. I'll say that we see in many cultures significant sex selection already. We see significant, as Down syndrome testing has become more commonplace, the rate of Down syndrome births have gone down dramatically, right? For those cases, I think really it is a question about whether you view this as bodily autonomy and the right to make decisions. And for me, as somebody who's thought a lot about the personhood of fetuses and personhood of embryos, the philosophical or political theory argument that I've always found the most attractive to me is Judith Jarvis Thompson's famous hypothetical about the world's most famous violinist, and imagining one wakes up one morning and realizes one's been kidnapped and hooked up to this person and is a human dialysis for this person for 9 months. The question is, should you be able to unplug? And if you believe that somebody should be able to, that the fact that you found themselves in this situation, and it's true this person will die if you unplug, that doesn't create obligations to you. That's in a case where we're sure the world's most famous violinist is a person. And so, that to me, in some ways, is the easiest argument where people who disagree about the personhood of fetuses might still reach some kind of agreement. But notice that that agreement, I think what's interesting for me is that there's a group of people who think there are good reasons for abortion and bad reasons for abortion. And then there are people who think that abortion is really a matter of autonomy and control of one's body. And you could imagine a bizarro version of the United States where actually it was the libertarian wing of the Republican Party who's often very concerned about our bodies and government controls about our bodies, who would be the most exercised about restrictions regarding abortion. But we're not there, whether that's a question of historical contingency or whether it's a question about gender subordination, differences of genders, is kind of an open question. But for me, I think that there is, good reason to think that we ought to have control over anything, our bodies. And then I will say for me, and I've written about this, and I like to write things that piss off people on all sides of the spectrum, right, left, and right. That I find the focus on rape and incest exceptions very strange, both on the left and on the right, and that I really don't understand what justifies them for people who otherwise want to restrict abortions, why those two are special on the right. And for people on the left, I worry that it kind of muddies our claims that the reason why people should have a right to have an abortion is because we should have a right to control our bodies, not a story about whether the way this came about was rape or incest or something else. And to me, we should not be drawing a line between women who are good and women who are victims. Instead, the view is that this should be a question about control over your body, generally speaking.
Yeah, so in some sense, it's a decision issue. it is very ironic that those who have high value for liberty and freedom are the ones who go against it. In this very, very narrow, specific case. And it's very unclear to me. I mean, it, so let me ask you a loaded question. Do you think this is related to religion? I mean, is this what they've been taught in church, and that is what they're trying to do?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's clearly in the history of this in America. And if you look at kind of the demographics and people's views, it would be impossible to think it's unrelated to religion and upbringing. Now, but I don't want to suggest that the only way to justify a position that is restrictive on abortion requires you to have religious premises. That is to say, you cannot be secular and against abortion. I think there are plenty of secular arguments that lead you to the same place. But I do think that there are flocks of birds that fly together and people who tend to be some religious groups because other religions have different points at which the personhood or the moral significance of the fetus, whether it's quickening, whether it's later, depending on the religious group, that there actually isn't a holistic and homogenous view even amongst religious groups.
Hmm.
But it's definitely true that the alignment between movement politics, Republican, Democrats, and religion, that the three are not, and views about abortion, that the four are not wholly unconnected. There are instead, demographically speaking, constituencies that are tied together.
Yes, I want to go on the topic, but just one last thing here. So this is really a technology-related question because this is a medical question. I know that the 9 people in Washington are so great. They pretty much know everything that I can think of, but I suspect they don't know much about medicine, maybe. Um, and so these 9 people, 6 of them make better decisions than the other 3. I would contend. Those 6, they have no clue about medicine. I would say. So do we have a system where ignorant people are put into making medical decisions for the country?
So it's very interesting that you asked this question, that there was an oral argument, I think it was maybe a week or two ago, on gender affirming care and a ban in Tennessee against access to puberty blockers, among other things, for adolescent patients and younger. And I'm going to disclose that I've been an expert witness in some of this litigation, so I have definitely have a viewpoint that's related to this. But in the course of the oral argument, this was one of the points of discussion about what is the role of a judge here and medical evidence, medical information. So one interesting thing is that it's somewhat of a Justice Scalia once described himself as a fair weather originalist, and I think sometimes
Hmm.
they are fair weather deferential to medicine when being deferential achieves what they think is the best outcome, maybe less deferential. We saw this a little bit in COVID as well. We've seen this over the years. But I do think the question that's being asked judges are asked to decide all sorts of technical questions, whether it's the economics of antitrust, whether it's
Hmm.
understanding how very complex patents work, whether it's sociological questions. And they muddle through. They're not experts, but the question they're always asked is, and in the EMTALA case we were talking about, the Moyle and the companion case, was when the statute says this, how does it apply to the statute in the state that says this? And as again, if the statute in the state prohibits an abortion in this instance, is that also covered by the federal law? And when you put the question that way, it seems like a kind of question that's within the competency of judges and justices. So my own view
Hmm.
is that um, we should, as lawyers, as people in the world, and as judges and justices, we should be appropriately modest and epistemically humble about what we don't
Hmm.
do. But someone will ultimately have to decide these questions one way or the other when you have a conflict.
Hmm.
And, it's a question, it is a legal question and as a political constituency, a political theoretical question, how much deference ought to be given to positions or not. But that's a
Hmm.
question you can't escape answering.
Hmm. So I'm going to go into another interesting topic, which is also pretty topical: pressing regulatory challenges for psychedelic medicine. So you say here over the past decade, research on potential therapeutic benefits of psychedelics has demonstrated promise and generated enthusiasm. The number of psychedelic clinical trials has grown dramatically, and there has been considerable private investment and regulatory interest in psychedelic drug development around the world. But you said this is a complicated moment for regulators seeking to impose a traditional regime of clinical trials and pharmaceutical pre-market approval to a class of drugs already used outside the medical establishment through a patchwork of state and local regulation, indigenous use, and underground consumption. Yeah, so I'm a little bit familiar with this, Glenn. So, um, I mean, we know that psychedelics are quite useful because we have a lot of data how this could actually benefit um, certain conditions. But then, so I don't know if this is in your research, but we have this class called nutraceuticals,
Yep.
where FDA has sort of let it go, sort of thing. Uh, so could psychedelics could be in that cohort than sort of an FDA control regime?
Yeah, it's a great question. So probably not, and I'll tell you why in a few words. First of all, one of the nice things I like is that for that quote from that paper, I think it's from the paper from several months ago, before FDA had to consider its first, or finally considered its first new drug application from Lykos for an MDMA assisted therapy for PTSD. So I'm glad at least saying it's very complicated. This is going to be hard for FDA, and it's not quite a great fit. That we weren't wrong about that because FDA issued a complete response letter, which is basically a no to the sponsor, although the sponsor can come back, and there's other sponsors in the wings. But there's a couple of reasons why I think that the supplement route, because again, Congress itself has actually told FDA to have very light, if any, regulation on supplements.
Hmm.
And there's some good things and bad things about this. I often tell people that if you want to get vitamin D or echinacea, that like even between the same branded bottle, you no guarantee it's the same substance. Let alone if you try to buy
Yeah.
it the CVS brand versus the Walmart brand versus something like that. So it's a very different from. But for these drugs, the background kind of rule for most of them is they're scheduled under the Controlled Substances Act, which means that there's heavily restricted about whether they can be sold and used in what context, and essentially are not available for lawful sale.
Hmm.
In order to get rescheduling, it's not a requirement, but one thing that'd be very helpful in terms of rescheduling is if FDA were to grant approval, and again, the first proposal was for MDMA, ecstasy is the street name. The next one will probably be before them will probably be psilocybin or magic mushrooms is kind of the street name.
Hmm.
If FDA should approve one of those, what are the conditions for the current scheduling and where they are in the drug schedules? Is that there can't be this medical benefit. So the moment there is a medical benefit that has been shown and it's sufficiently, and an FDA approval would kind of push us all the way there, that
Hmm.
would be a grounds for a rescheduling. Now, you might think the ideal world is there's some bad things about the FDA pathway. One is that they give exclusivity to a company. The company has to spend a significant amount of money, time, effort showing they're safe and effective. So it's positive to have that information. On the flip side, the maker gets exclusivity to sell it and can
Hmm.
control the market in a way that raises the prices, as opposed to, let's say, in a space where there's no FDA approval and no data exclusivity, where multiple people could sell it and the like.
Hmm.
I will say that I think my own view is that it's hard enough for us to get people comfortable in the medical establishment with this as an FDA approved substance. And they're powerful substances and they have long anthropological histories in various communities and faith communities. And, many of whom view it as spirit medicine or actually with something, an item of respect. And so, there's all sorts of complicated cross currents. But I don't think it's likely that Given how hard it's been to get even FDA approval, I think the alternative of no regulatory regime around it or a very loose regulatory regime around it, I think is very hard to imagine. But you never know. Mr. Musk, as I understand from the public reporting, is a user of some psychedelics and very close to the president. I actually tell people, while there's many issues I work on where the Trump administration is going to be very bad for the issue, this might not be one of them. And what's interesting about psychedelics is it has a real bipartisan support that brings together, as I like to say, veterans suffering PTSD, religious communities, hippies, libertarians, right? Like very unusual political constituencies and big pharma all together interested in these substances. So I think that's interesting and possibly hopeful.
Yeah, I mean, that's very interesting, Glenn. So this goes back to the decision question. Um, so who is going to decide what is good and what is bad? And if we have a very broad definition of pharmaceuticals, which is, we are putting a bunch of chemicals into a vat and, something comes out, type thing. Two, perhaps just concentrating naturally available materials. Is there a demarcation there? And if there is, then you have to potentially, I don't know the right answer here. I just have to potentially leave it to the user to say, I'm the decision maker here, not the regulators.
Yeah, I mean, it's a possible regime. I will say when things affect the structure or function of the body, and there's various definitions of drugs and biologics in the FDA system, we have, and it wasn't always this way. If you go back 200 years, you go back to the early parts of the founding of this country, different kinds of regulation, different kinds of regulatory structures. The idea of being required to show efficacy rather than just safety is of more, or the emphasis on efficacy, maybe not the to show it at all, but the emphasis on efficacy of relatively more recent vintage.
Hmm.
And in Europe, you could also trade less pre-market review for more stringent post-market review, real-world evidence, and the like. But all that said, so I think that these are interesting conversations. But my own view is that the substance of psychedelics in particular, if you ask me, okay, well, FDA wants to move in this direction, what is the test case for moving in this direction? I
Hmm.
think it's unlikely that it's going to be psychedelics in part because of all of the cultural baggage
Yeah.
attached to it. Now, all that said, there are states like Oregon who, for as a matter of state law, have adopted regimes that are kind of not really medicalized. They have a facilitator system where you can get a facilitator license that's not the same as being a physician. And indeed, there's restrictions on doing this as part of your medical practice.
Hmm.
And the idea is that maybe there's something that's not just complete permissive, anybody can use it if they want to, and
Hmm.
also not pharma, MDMA brought to you by big pharma, right?
Hmm.
That maybe there's a space in between for other kinds of regimes and creativity, and maybe psychedelics will be a space where more of this catches on because there is reason to see some of this experimentation at the state level.
Yeah, so I'm thinking, Glenn, if I integrate happiness over a very fixed horizon, which is the person's lifetime, and if my objective function is maximizing that aggregate happiness, then you could make different decisions, right? So, uh, sometimes I feel like we have gone too far into some sort of regulatory regime where you say, you can't do that. But why? We don't have a systematic answer to why, from an analytical mathematical perspective, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think there could be multiple different regimes. I will say that with drugs, we have in history instances where, like thalidomide, for example, where the risks and the concerns were significant, and also to realize, and this is something I admire it among anybody who is a trialist, right? Whether they're a medical trialist or I have a colleague that does randomized trials of offering people legal interventions versus not, which is important. But you realize how difficult and expensive it is to know whether something actually works and to produce evidence for it.
Yeah.
And you might say there are instances where actually that kind of information generation is not worth it. and we'd be just as happy to let people. But I think those are instances probably where your worst case scenario, your safety kind of concerns is
Mm.
low, and the efficacy may also be low, but we'll see what happens. I don't know if
Yeah.
it's fair to describe psychedelics that way, although I will say that, I think, I look at the regime around alcohol, for example, and I ask
Mm.
myself, why do we have a much more permissive regime as towards alcohol as
Yeah.
compared to marijuana? And the answer is not, oh, because we've thought this through, we've done the kind of economic assessment or behavioral assessment you have in mind. The answer is because of a history of lobbying, a history of organizations, a history of how these substances uh, capture social ideas and social technological kinds of spaces. And they can
Mm.
change. I think about it as when I was a young man, the amount of smoking I would see depicted in television and movies. And I think now the idea and that, and how vaping has become something quite distinctive from smoking. And so these are really
Mm.
cultural constructions. And to
Yeah.
realize that, well, I'm a lawyer and an ethicist, and I can tell you all about those things. What actually sometimes moves the needles is changes into what Hollywood does and changes to what kids find interesting or don't find interesting, and what social media does.
So I want to go to another topic, a completely different topic, borrowed wombs on uterus transplants and the right to experience pregnancy. You say here 1 in 500 women suffer from uterine factor infertility. Women who were born without a uterus, lost a uterus, or the uterus no longer functions. Historically, this condition meant that some women had no chance to ever have a pregnancy. But that reality changed in December 2017, where it was announced that the first birth from a uterus transplant in America occurred at the Baylor University. Yeah, so when I was reading through this, Glenn, I was embarrassed. It's like technology is advancing so fast. If you blink, you don't know what the heck happened. I had no clue this was actually happening. I had to go back and look at some of the material. And so we actually transplanted uterus from X to Y, and Y actually had a baby with somebody else's uterus. So yeah, I mean, technology aside, as you say here, it brings a lot of legal issues into this too, right? So just describe this a little bit. Yeah, what happened there? Yeah.
Yeah, I often like to say I only work on boring and uncontroversial topics, right? So you're getting a sense of that. So, I mean, and you shouldn't feel bad in that. I think actually, as stories go, this one was a little under reported, right? Like it's kind of an interesting what catches people's imagination. But this one, when I tell people about it, they're really quite shocked. But it began outside the United States. Now we've had a few in the US. It's complicated surgery. Not everybody can do it, but essentially the idea is from either a dead donor or more recently a living donor, one can transplant the uterus from one woman to another, like other forms of transplantation. And then through in vitro fertilization, they can become pregnant, they can carry a baby to term. And then typically after delivery, the uterus will be removed such that the person does not have to stay on immunosuppressive drugs. And part of what's interesting is that some of the uterus transplants this early on have been actually from mother to daughter.
Sorry.
So the person giving, oh, don't be so, the person giving the uterus is both the uterine mother giving it to her daughter. So she is both genetic grandmother to the child, but in a real sense, uterine mother, if you think of that as a
Hmm.
kind of category. So to give your own daughter the uterus that she was born from to her to use, kind of passing
Hmm.
it forward. It's really just like very unusual and odd. And in the future, it may also be possible to transplant uteruses onto male pelvises, which might be important for trans people, or to try to equalize the burden of pregnancy, which is a real burden. What I'll say is that part of what's interesting about this is that we have reproductive technologies in the United States, and they're regulated one way. They're mostly pretty light touch regulation. And then we have organ transplantation on the other, which is heavily regulated and very complicated sorts of things. And what I like
Okay.
about this particular topic is it puts the two together in a way to ask yourself. And if you think, okay,
Mm,
well, somebody wants a uterus transplant. What does it do for them that they can't get without it? And it really is this idea that pregnancy itself might be an experience that we think is worthwhile to have or make someone
mm,
feel like a mother because they could achieve the same end with a surrogate. And actually, the cost in most instances of a surrogate would be cheaper, all things equal, for the system. The cost rather than self-pay, the cost would
yeah.
be cheaper for a surrogate. But especially for countries that have misgivings about surrogacy, they've actually been some of the first movers, the ones most interested in this technology because it's an alternative to surrogacy.
Mm. That's so interesting, Glenn. So as a surrogate, so it's technically IVF there, right? So it's the same baby, um, potentially. I mean, one could argue 9 months make a baby. And so what you're arguing here is that just the experience of going through it has a significant utility for the mother. Um, but this is truly an organ transplantation, right? So I mean, you have to go through matches, you have to, and then you have to have organ rejection drugs, and so it is not simple. It's very, very complicated. Yeah.
It's complicated, it's expensive, it's difficult, and there are risks for both parties, more the recipient, well, both the donor and the recipient. And I think it is worthwhile always to take a pause and ask, why are we doing this? And it's
Hmm.
clear the people involved, right, think it's important enough that they're willing to undertake it. The surgeons who are transplant surgeons who have plenty of other opportunities to be transplant surgeons, they think it's important enough to invest it. But socially speaking, if you ask, for example, in should Medicaid pay for it? Should private health insurance pay for it? Should systems of socialized spending in medicine, like in Canada or the UK, should they pay for it? And what's the alternative? And how do we even think about valuing
Hmm.
this? On the flip side, there are people who want a genetic connection, and we spend a lot of money catering to that through in vitro fertilization and the like, or egg freezing. So there are all these technologies that give you a piece of parenthood or a piece of the experience, but not another piece.
Hmm.
And the question about how to value them and which are the ones that deserve state funding and state support and which ones don't, I think is quite complicated and quite interesting.
Yes, I was talking to my daughter recently about this. So the the process of delivering a baby is a very, very risky process, as you know, extremely risky for the mother. And um, as a species, we have done this forever, and we continue to do that. As an engineer, I would say we should be very close to creating sort of an artificial womb, where you could actually, I don't want to say it's manufacture, but technically manufacturing babies. So if technology advances to that level, do you think something like this could continue?
It's a great question, and I've actually written about artificial womb technology separately. So there's a group, I think, in Philadelphia, if I remember correctly, that has been working on artificial womb technology now, primarily actually for transfer from prematurely delivered babies. So not ectogenesis, I think is the correct term, not from conception, but the
Yeah.
idea is something happens over the course of a pregnancy, and the idea of that the child could be transferred in a way that would be helpful. Um, to me, I always ask myself, what's the need that would be met and how valuable is it? One great thing about it is we wouldn't need surrogacy. We would allow a much wider variation of individuals, single individuals, individuals who are same-sex male, for example, individuals with uterine infertility to use this technology. I think that there might be people, though, the question now would be, if you had the artificial womb and you want the uterus transplant, what is the difference between the two? And
Yeah.
is it, again, that ability to touch your own belly and to
Yeah.
feel the baby, touch it and feel at least some idea of kicking or to be carrying, and how we socially do that. I will say this returns to our first conversation on abortion. There would be an interesting question about people who are pro-choice on abortion, and I've written about this,
Mm,
whether if artificial wombs were available and became possible and transfer became possible at any point during a pregnancy,
yeah.
whether they would still argue for abortion as opposed to a transfer. So the more you think it's about bodily autonomy and a right against forced gestation, the more you
Mm,
think actually transfer to an artificial womb would be a solution. The more you think having an abortion is about terminating any relationship whatsoever from this entity, the fetus that you don't feel you want a connection to. In
mm,
some ways, the transfer to the artificial womb doesn't solve that problem. And so, what I think is
yeah.
interesting is that thinking about this technology forces us to really examine very closely what is it we're hoping to achieve
Mm.
and to disentangle various kinds of possibilities.
Yeah, so in this case, the larger effect is on the mother, I would argue, and perhaps less on the baby. But we don't know how the whole thing works. So, they say, babies start to hear her mother maybe 3, 4, 5 months into the process. And so, some manufacturing plant out in New York may not be equivalent to actually carrying the baby. And those things we have to really understand. But it is it is a technology that we could now have access to, right? Which is really amazing. I mean, I didn't even think this happened 7 years ago. It's beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing. And again, I mean, science finds a way. There's other things I work on that tell people, and they're shocked that this exists. But this is one of the ones I talk to people, and they're just really, really surprised that we're already there. They say, my partner says that I'm always the intersection of science fact and science fiction, and that's kind of where my work is right on
Yes.
the cusp. And sometimes you can't tell which of the two it is, but this one happens to be science fact.
Yes. So I want to go into a set of topics that are completely different, and we'll finish up with that. So you have a paper here locating liability for medical AI. I'm very interested in this. So you say when medical AI systems fail, who should be responsible and how? You say here, we argue that various features of medical AI complicate the application of existing tort doctrines and render them ineffective at creating incentives for the safe and effective use of medical AI. In addition to complexity and opacity, the problem of contextual bias, where medical AI systems vary substantially in performance from place to place, hampers traditional doctrines. We suggest instead the application of enterprise liability to hospitals, making them broadly liable for negligent injuries occurring within the hospital system. Um, so I like that part. So, but you go on here and say, if hospitals must have access to the information needed for adaptation and monitoring, if that information is unavailable, we suggest that liability should shift from hospitals to the developers, keeping information secret. So that part I'm less sure about, Glenn. So um, yeah, so I mean, liability should be sort of based on the end outcome. Uh, AI for me is a technology, just like CAT scan or some things that the hospital has implemented, and they are sort of enterprise liability exists. If they use the technology incorrectly, there could be issues. So enterprise liability seems more elegant to me. The developers, so we have aircrafts out there. Aircrafts are AI machines, and when the aircraft crashes, if you go out and look at Boeing, who actually created that piece of software, I think that would be quite problematic from a legal perspective. So I don't know anything about legal aspect, Glenn. So I'll throw this out for you to react to it. Yeah.
Yeah, let me give you three quick reactions. This is a paper I did with my great colleague, Nicholson Price. So the first is just to say, turns out medical malpractice is not so great, even in simple cases, right? If you look at the results and look at which cases end up in front of juries, what the results are, you don't end up with a huge amount of confidence that it's like the best way to achieve our social goals. So one possibility is we're already in second or third best world if we're talking about malpractice, and something much more like a workers' compensation fund system or a
Mm,
victims' compensation fund would actually be, plus regulation would actually be better. Okay, so that's the first point. The second point is just to say that I think the comparison to air and air safety is very interesting because this is often made in the medical space. The other one I always hear is driverless cars as the
mm,
comparison. I do think there's a way in which medical AI is a little different from either, and that is just the number of people who are involved from the developer, between the developer and the ultimate person whose life goes better or worse, the patient, right?
mm,
We have regulators, we have hospital systems, we have physicians, we have nurses, we have insurers, right? All playing a part in the ecosystem,
mm,
such that I think it makes actually the problem of designing an optimal liability regime even more difficult as a result. Okay. Then the third base is to say, I'm glad you at least like the enterprise liability piece because some people don't even like that. So why this kind of caveat, though, there ought to be, so we start with a strong default of enterprise liability. Why do we like that? And then why do we have this caveat that there might be an instance where we ought to have a reversal of the rule in favor of developer liability? So the reason why the enterprise liability rule is better, I think, than the alternative of having the physicians themselves be liable is that while misuse of a tool is one thing, we just don't think it's possible for physicians realistically to be wise adopters and wise evaluators of medical AI, especially sophisticated medical AI. So the idea that we would be incentivizing them to be more careful or to make better decisions, we just
mm,
don't think that's like a very realistic picture of the kind of AI we're talking about. Whereas we do think there's a world in which the hospital systems are wise adopters. They have the resources, they have the scale, especially large academic medical centers, maybe tertiary care centers less so, to be the ones to make these decisions. And the idea that we would have some standard of liability should they make decisions in ways that are not actually thoughtful, sensitive, careful. Okay, so that's so far so good for the enterprise liability. Now, why have this one, I would say, caveat about the when the developer liability should go back? It's possible we're wrong about this. I think it
mm,
is that we have the view that there's a real gap between development and implementation,
mm,
and there are to be a good implementer. And I can tell you, I've seen medical AI systems that work great on paper or on showing test retest
mm, mm.
reliability or verification data set, and are terrible at implementation everywhere. I've seen
Yeah.
ones that are excellently implemented in one place,
Mm,
terribly implemented somewhere else. And the developers lack information to know how good the implementation is, but there
mm,
are instances where the hospital systems themselves lack enough information to know what they ought to be sensitive about in terms of their implementation and the ability to make a determination whether it's good for their patients or not. And it's
mm,
instances where that kind of information is being held back. So when we think about this as what's sometimes called an information forcing default rule. So set the
mm,
rule of liability in a way that causes the more informed party to disclose information in order to get rid of the liability. So force them to be more disclosing than they might otherwise want to be. And the idea is set the default that there's developer liability such that developers
mm,
may be forced to disclose more information in order to avoid it and more information than they might otherwise would. Now, in theory, that sounds like a pretty elegant solution.
mm, mm.
In reality, as Yogi Berra once said when asked the difference between theory and practice, he said, in theory, there's no difference between theory and practice, but in practice, there is. And so this might be an instance where in practice, it doesn't work very well. But that's at least the theoretical argument for why carving out this one space is a way of trying to force the sharing of information.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, Glenn. So this is sort of a good segue into your the other paper, the algorithmic explainability bait and switch. You say here explainability in AI and machine learning is emerging as a leading area of academic research and a topic of significant regulatory concern. Increasingly, academics, governments, and civil society groups are moving toward a consensus that AI must be explainable. In this article, we challenge this prevailing trend. Yeah, so I like your challenge. I don't know. I mean, AI is fundamentally, I mean, especially deep learning stuff that we are currently doing, it's by definition is a black box. And so if we start to say, well, you got to go inside the black box, make it a gray box, and uh, then the whole utility of AI could vanish at some point. So basically, if I say I have to come up with a regression equation for the stuff that this black box is putting out, that is sort of wasting everybody's time, right? And so, what are thoughts on this? It's explainability in AI.
Yeah. So I like to distinguish interpretable AI from explainable AI. The interpretable AI is simple regressions, right? The ability to know how input to output. And there is an argument that in many settings, we don't need sophisticated AI, that the performance difference between a neural net, for example, and something much simpler that is interpretable is small enough that we should always just default towards the interpretable or required interpretable.
Hmm.
Medicine often is not one of those settings where that's true, and that much of the medical AI we have, I don't think that the interpretable is like itself an adequate substitute. And maybe if it isn't, we should look at those trade-offs. But people want to have their cake and eat it too, and the way they do it, as you say, is to generate white boxes that explain the black box, these kind of explainability algorithms, but they can't exactly be the black box because if they explain it perfectly and match input and output perfectly, then they are the black box we can't
Yes.
understand. So by
Yeah.
definition, there has to be some slippage. And what I'll say maybe two things about this because I know we're getting close to the end of time. One is just to say that I think that the explanations we're getting some of these times is what I would call fool's gold or ersatz explanation is an unexplanation, but it
Hmm.
doesn't actually have robustness across all cases, and it fools us into thinking we're understanding better what we are doing than we actually are. And then the second thing to say is just to say that I think there might be instances where, and I think about, giving people sentences, for example, or whether you get out of probation, so civil society, or
Hmm.
whether you get evicted from your house, where the idea of being able to say, oh, well, I don't know why I came up with this. It just did. I'm sorry, you're going to spend a couple more years in prison. That's political, theoretically speaking, that's just unacceptable that we have a tradition of reason giving. But in
Yeah.
medicine, there's plenty of spaces where we have no idea why something works, but high confidence that it works. I mean, aspirin is a great example of this, but there's many spaces in medicine where we
Hmm.
have no idea the mechanistic explanations. And by the way, knowing the mechanistic explanations might not help us in our practice. So for me, I would be rather there be less focus on explanation and more focus on other epistemic warrants of reliability and trustworthiness,
Hmm.
including clinical trials. But hard to run these clinical trials, and especially if you take the idea, as you said a few moments ago, about contextual learning and contextual difference seriously, it may
Hmm.
be that we need a huge number of clinical trials that are much more localized. So all I want to say is that I want to dethrone explainability as the king of the realm and realize that A, it's sometimes not so great, and B, there might be other royals in contention for the throne.
I like that. Yeah, I love black boxes, Glenn. The human brain is a black box. So if somebody tells me, I have to explain every one of my decision, that's going to be quite difficult. Um, and so for us to adopt the technology, I think we have to come up with some other way to think about this. I don't know what it is, but it is not quite explainable. That is the issue. Yeah.
Exactly right. And that, we learned this in the last generation or a couple generations ago of AI, where we tried to build expert systems by following experts around and asking them, well, why did you do this? Why did you do that? Why are you asking that question? Turns out our metacognition as to ourselves is extremely poor. So there's a way in which maybe we're expecting more from the AI than we should even expect for ourselves. And we think about judges and how they decide.
Yes.
Their ability to get inside, as you say, the black box of their brain might not be so great either.
Yes. Yes. Excellent. Yeah. This has been great, Glenn. Thanks so much for spending time with me.
Thank you for having me.